All right, so good morning and welcome to Caron's chapel service. The topic for today's message is the grace of imperfection. So let me begin by asking, have you ever approached New Year's with an attitude that you're going to take on all of your bad habits and entirely devote yourself to self-improvement? That you're going to start a diet, and go to the gym, and buy a new wardrobe, and maybe even enroll in a class? That next year you're going to become perfect? Well, I have, and I found that it never worked. Right? After a few weeks at most, I collapse under the pressure that I've created for myself. So take a lesson. Early sobriety can set off the same type of thinking and chain of events for you. Don't try to stay sober, quit smoking, and lose weight simultaneously. Don't attempt to tackle everything. Because if you do, you'll be setting yourself up for losing what is really most important for you, your sobriety. Whatever you put before your sobriety, be prepared to lose. And remember what we learned in the rooms, and that is that there should be no major changes in your first year. Well, this sort of thinking and undertaking for self-improvement is usually rooted in our desire to become perfect. But becoming perfect is not a healthy objective. It's more likely to result in neurosis. Problems arise whenever we set standards for ourselves that are unrealistically high and inflexible. It can result in perfectionism, and the human being is incapable of becoming perfect. Remember, as the big book says, our goal is progress, not perfection. Of course, growth and change is good for all of us, but when it's taken to an extreme, it can be toxic, because perfectionism is ultimately divisive, non-compassionate, demanding, shame-based, judgmental, and isolating. If you examine the underpinnings of perfectionism, you will discover arrogance and the ego. It's really about a desire to be God in a new disguise. According to the psychoanalyst Caron, the perfectionist, quote, sets to work into molding themselves into a supreme being of their own making. They hold before their soul an image of perfection and unconsciously tell themselves, forget about the disgraceful creature you actually are, this is how you should be. And to be this idealized self is all that matters. She was the first to label this type of thinking back in 1950, the tyranny of the shoulds. And that's the problem with perfectionism. We think we are God, and we find ourselves living with the chronic anxiety of the woulda, coulda, shouldas. As Bill Wilson taught us, we have to quit playing God. It doesn't work, because whenever you try to be God, destruction follows. When you really examine the results of perfectionism, you begin to see its destructive elements. You become arrogant. You're right all the time. You lose compassion and become self-absorbed. Why can't others be like me? You become intolerant. And perhaps worst of all, you've got nothing to become, nothing to work on, nothing to improve, nowhere to grow. Being imperfect, on the other hand, results in humility. You're not the center of the universe. It also results in empathy. you can understand that you have your challenges and other people have theirs. It's been said that a good man falls 7 times a day. And when you fall, you're given the opportunity to grow. You grow in self-knowledge. Although perfectionism is born in the ego, it can also affect one's soul. Secular perfectionism demands you be skinny and rich and live in luxurious circumstances with other beautiful people. Spiritual perfectionism demands that you be without fault. But when you do the 4th step, we uncover all sorts of murky things and dispositions that can lead us to believe that we might be evil. This usually is accompanied by a sense of shame and guilt. And sure, we've all done bad things, but we're not evil. In many ways, perfectionism is an adolescent, immature notion of spirituality. It's not of God, because God never tortures us. The enemy does. If you were to gather a room full of spiritual leaders together and ask them to identify the most misunderstood and damaging sentence that Jesus uttered, it would be the words that you'll hear today in one of our readings. So be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. Well, taken out of context, this sentence will lead to scrupulosity, the belief that you are damaged goods and can never be forgiven. But the context of this passage, as you will hear, is actually a lesson in forgiveness. It's really about forgiving others. But this must first include forgiving oneself. What Jesus is really saying is that we become perfect when we extend forgiveness. And that's when we'll know that we're on the right road. In the 4th step, we identify shortfalls. We see our imperfections in the light of day. This is not designed as a lesson in shame or guilt. It's simply, as he calls it, an inventory. What Bill calls honest self-appraisal. Examining our own behavior serves as a gateway to tolerance for ourselves and with others for their imperfections. And our imperfections are about growth opportunities. They're not a license to beat yourself up and sink into shame. And all spiritual growth begins from knowing your demons and then being on guard. As the 7th step informs us, it's our higher power who has the ability to remove them, not us. When we identify our imperfections with the help of a sponsor, we find ourselves more aware of them as they grow up. We get plunged more deeply into them. We don't overcome character defects by simply avoiding them. And the paradox of spiritual growth is hidden within the imperfection. Then, when we ask them to be removed, we will discover that when we ask to be forgiven, we will be given opportunities to forgive. When we ask God for patience, we'll be given situations where we will need to develop patience, like the longest checkout line. When we ask God for courage, we will be given situations that we fear. And we ask for strength, we're going to be given trials to make us strong. And when we ask God for love, we're going to be given people who need to be loved. And when we ask God for help with self-improvement, what we will receive is self-acceptance. Real growth happens when we are most vulnerable, not perfect, not proud. We learn very little from success. No relationship is perfect. We fail ourselves and we fail others. The spiritual journey is ultimately about a constant falling and getting up again, of building something up only to have it knocked down and then having to build it up again. The journey is about waking up most mornings and realizing that we are not as far ahead as we want to be. And that is perfectly okay, as long as we're determined to do something about it. The funny thing is, and this may sound counterintuitive, but perfectionists often achieve less than those with healthier, imperfect attitudes. Perfectionists often find themselves immobilized by their perceived inabilities to get things right. They're overly critical of their own behavior and are less likely to be aware of their own strengths. They're unable to derive any real satisfaction from a successful performance. They are plagued with self-doubt and prone to self-criticism, and they are more likely to avoid, quit, or procrastinate because they believe it will ultimately lead to failure. Because they have such unrealistic expectations, they're also less likely to delegate for fear of being disappointed by anyone else's performance that turns out to be less than perfect. Perfectionism never happens in a vacuum. It touches everyone around us. We can pass it down to our children. We can infect our workplace with impossible expectations, and it can suffocate our friends and our families. Thankfully, compassion also spreads quickly. When we're kind to ourselves, we create a reservoir of compassion that we're then able to extend to others. When we can let go of what other people think about our own story, we gain access to our worthiness, the feeling that we are enough just as we are, and that we are worthy of love and belonging. Trying to be perfect is a tragic mistake and goal. As Abraham Lincoln concluded, God must love ordinary people. He made so many of us. God is not looking for perfectionism in us. What God is really looking for is a relationship with us. And then we grow and learn to lean on our higher power. The simple truth of all this rests in knowing that we can only love others as much as we are able to love ourselves. We need to accept ourselves and our limitations and simply grow each day. Don't go about trying to become someone else. Don't waste your time trying to make someone else like yourself. God made just one of you for this world. So be yourself. Be human, not God.
you.